The hostess pulled the door open before I could knock, like she'd been told to watch for me. My hands were sweating around the strap of my purse. 3 years of silence. And tonight, my husband had called me himself, voice soft as Sunday morning, asking me to come make things right. I hadn't slept the night before. I kept thinking about my daughter's laugh, the sound of it, how long it had been since I'd heard it in person. My name is Dovie Boatwright, and I walked into that restaurant believing my family wanted me back. The room hit me before the hostess even finished leading me to the table. 25 faces turned toward me at once. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, neighbors from 2 streets over, people I didn't recognize at all. The table stretched the length of the back wall, already full. Lobster tails split open and glistening. Wagyu sliced thin on white china. A wine bottle standing tall at the head of the table. The label gold and heavy, looking like it cost more than my first car payment ever did. Dwight stood near the back wall, arms crossed, eyes somewhere on the floor. My own son couldn't look at me. "What is all this?" I asked, soft, still smiling, still hoping I had this wrong. Alton came toward me then, the way he used to when we were young and he wanted something. That easy, warm walk, like nothing between us had ever broken. "It's Kendra's engagement dinner," he said. "We wanted you here for it." I looked past him for my daughter, found her 3 seats down in a dress the color of champagne, not meeting my eyes either. Engaged, getting married. And I was finding out tonight, in a room full of strangers, like I was the last name added to a list nobody wanted to write. If you're watching this right now, tell me in the comments what time it is, where you are. I want to know who's sitting with me through this. Alton's smile didn't move. He leaned in close enough that only I could hear it. "You're paying, right?" 4 words. No hello. No, how have you been? No, I'm sorry it's been 3 years. Just a bill, waiting on me like I was the reason they'd called me here in the first place. I smiled. I nodded. Something in my chest went quiet and still, the way a house goes quiet right before a storm finishes building outside. I understood, all at once, exactly why I'd gotten that phone call. Not love, not forgiveness. A wallet they remembered I might still be. I lifted my hand and waved the waiter over, calm as I'd ever been in my life. He leaned down, and I said 2 sentences to him, low enough that nobody at that table heard a word. He nodded once, like he understood completely, and walked away. I sat back down, smiled at my daughter, smiled at the cousins I hadn't seen in years. Let them talk, let them laugh, let them pour more wine like the night belonged to them. 15 minutes later, the waiters came back, not with more food, but with boxes. Every plate, lifted and packed one by one while the table went silent, watching it happen. The $400 bottle was corked and carried off with the rest. A young waiter stood at the head of the table and announced, loud enough for all 25 guests to hear, that dinner had been paid for in full. And every bit of it was now on its way to the shelter on Jefferson Avenue. Alton's smile disappeared in real time, like someone had reached over and turned it off. The doctor said the word like it was nothing, like he was reading me a grocery list. Stage 2. Treatable. I remember staring at the calendar on his wall instead of his face, counting the months until Kendra's birthday, like that mattered more than what he'd just told me. Alton drove me home that day, holding my hand at every red light. He kept saying we'd handle it together, the 2 of us, like we'd handled everything else in 30 years of marriage. I believed him. I had no reason yet not to. The first round of treatment came with a bill that made my stomach drop before the medicine even had a chance to. Insurance covered some of it. Not enough. Alton sat at the kitchen table that night with the statement spread out in front of him, jaw tight, not saying a word for a long time. "We'll figure it out," he finally said. But his voice had already changed. Flatter. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. By the third round, I was too sick most days to cook. Too weak to keep the house the way I used to. Alton started staying later at work, or saying he was. The bills kept coming. Thick envelopes stacking on the counter like a wall building itself between us. Every conversation found its way back to money. How much this was costing, how much more was coming, how things used to be easier before all this. I never once heard him ask how I was feeling that week. One evening, I came out of the bedroom and heard him on the phone in the garage, voice low, thinking I was asleep. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he was saying. "She's becoming too much to carry." I stood in the hallway with my hand against the wall, chemo still thick in my blood, and told myself he meant the bills. Just the bills. Not me. I wanted to believe that so badly I made myself believe it. Dwight grew quiet around me those months, polite in the careful way you are with someone you're trying not to upset. Kendra called less, always with some reason. Work, her friends, things I understood, things I told myself were normal for a grown daughter building her own life. I told myself this was just what hard seasons looked like in a marriage. Stress does this. Money does this. Sickness does this. People pull inward to survive, and they come back around once it's over. I held on to that the way I held onto the railing walking up our porch steps after treatments, legs shaking, determined not to fall in front of the neighbors. One Thursday, I came home from chemo, more drained than usual, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes. I wanted nothing but my bed. I walked past Dwight's room on the way there and stopped. The door was open. The bed was stripped down to the mattress. The closet hung empty, hangers swaying slightly from where someone had pulled clothes off them in a hurry. His desk was gone. His pictures off the wall, leaving pale squares in the paint where they used to be. I stood in that doorway, holding the strap of my purse, treatment still burning faint in my arm, and called his name into a room that didn't answer. He'd moved in with Alton's sister, 3 streets over, and neither of them had said a single word to me about it. Alton found me in the kitchen 2 days after Dwight's room turned up empty, leaning against the counter like he'd rehearsed where to stand. "I think I need some space," he said. "Not a divorce, just space, time to think." I asked him to think about what, exactly. He didn't answer that. He just said he'd be staying at his sister's for a while, where Dwight already was, and that he'd check in, like I was an appointment he might keep. He packed 2 suitcases that weekend. Left the house quieter than I'd ever heard it, even with the television on. I sat at the kitchen table that first night alone and looked at the stack of medical bills he used to at least pretend to worry over with me. Now they were only mine to worry over. The next round of treatment came, and so did the next bill, and I paid what I could and let the rest sit. Alton's name stayed on the insurance, but the calls about coverage started coming straight to me, no one standing beside me at the table to share the weight of it. I learned to sit through chemo with my phone face down in my lap, because every time it lit up, I hoped, and every time, it wasn't him. Kendra called less and less. When she did, the conversations stayed short, careful, like she was reading from a script someone else wrote for her. I asked her once if she'd talked to her father, and she got quiet in a way that told me more than any answer could have. "He's just going through a lot, Mama," she said, like I wasn't going through anything at all. I wanted to ask her, going through a lot of what? I was the one sick. I was the one alone in that house most nights, finishing treatment and driving myself home because there was nobody else to call. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't want to be the bitter one. I didn't want to be the reason my daughter pulled further away. So I stayed quiet too. And the quiet between us grew teeth, Months passed that way. No divorce papers ever came. No lawyer ever called. Alton never filed anything, never made it official, never gave me a single document I could hold in my hand and say, "This is where it ended." I was still his wife on paper, still bound to a man who'd walked out the door without bothering to close it behind him properly. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that, being left without the dignity of an ending. A divorce is at least honest. A divorce says, "This is over. Here's why. Here's what happens next." What Alton gave me instead was silence dressed up as space. A marriage left to rot quietly instead of being put down with any mercy. I called Kendra on a Sunday evening, treatment fog still sitting heavy behind my eyes, just wanting to hear her voice say something soft. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message anyway, told her I loved her, told her to call me when she had a minute, told her I missed her laugh. She never called back. That voicemail sat unanswered for so long I eventually stopped checking to see if she'd listened to it at all. 3 years would pass before either of us said another word to each other. The day they told me I was in remission, I drove home to an empty house and didn't have a single person to call. I sat in the driveway with the engine off for a long time, looking at the porch I used to climb on shaking legs, thinking I'd feel something close to victory. I didn't. I just felt tired, in a way that had nothing left to do with chemo. The house went next. Alton's name was still on the mortgage, but his money had stopped coming months before, and mine alone couldn't carry what we used to carry together. I fell behind on the payments little by little, each missed month bringing more letters, more late notices, more phone calls. I eventually stopped answering because I already knew what they were going to say. By the time a notice warning that foreclosure proceedings could begin arrived, I'd accepted I couldn't save the house on my own. I sold it before it reached that point, paid off what I owed, packed what mattered, and moved into a 1-bedroom rental on the other side of town, the kind of place with thin walls and a landlord who only answered every other call. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that year just to get through the days. My birthday came that spring, and something in me decided to try one more time. I called Kendra first, sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't really mine, in a room with boxes still stacked against the wall. The phone rang out. I called Dwight next. Same thing. I sent a text to both of them, "Just thinking about you both today. Hope you're well." And watched the message sit there unanswered, the little check mark telling me it had been delivered and read, and still, nothing came back. I sat with that phone in my lap until the room went dark around me, and something in my chest finally accepted what I'd been refusing to all year. They weren't coming back because they were busy. They weren't coming back because they'd decided I wasn't worth coming back for. I cried that night the way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the treatments. Not for my body this time. For the version of my family I'd been keeping alive in my head, the one that was going to come back around once things calmed down. That version didn't exist. Maybe it never had. Money didn't wait for grief to finish, though. I needed work, and work wasn't easy to find for a woman my age, fresh out of treatment with a gap in her resume that read like a question mark. I went to church that Sunday, more out of habit than faith, and on the bulletin board by the door, half covered by a flyer for a bake sale, I saw it. A small handwritten card asking for a live-in caregiver, experience preferred, but not required, good with people, patient. I stood there reading it twice. Patient. I had become very good at being patient, whether I wanted to be or not. I told myself this wasn't giving up on my family. This was simply choosing to live instead of waiting by a phone that wasn't going to ring. I took the number off that card before I let myself think too hard about it. The woman on the other end was named Bertie Lofton, 81 years old, recently widowed, in need of someone who could stay. I had no idea, dialing her number with my hands still shaking, that I was about to meet the only person left in my life who would choose to keep me. Miss Birdie's house sat at the end of a quiet street, small and neat, with flowers along the walkway that somebody had clearly loved once and nobody had touched in a while. I stood at the door with my one suitcase and knocked twice before I heard her voice through the screen, sharp as a slap. "I'm not dead yet. Doors open." She sat in a high-backed chair in the front room, a thin woman with silver hair pulled tight and eyes that didn't miss much. She looked me over, slow, head to shoes, before she said a word. "They send me somebody new every few months," she said. "None of them last." I told her I wasn't planning on being one of the ones who didn't. That's what the last one said too. She turned back to her window like I'd already disappointed her. I learned the shape of her house and her habits over the next few days, where she liked her tea, what time she wanted her medication, how she didn't like to be touched without warning. I learned, too, that she had no children, no husband left living, nobody close but a niece who called twice a year, usually around holidays, usually short. Miss Birdie never said it outright, but I could hear it underneath everything. She'd been left alone the same way I had, just slower, quieter, over a longer stretch of years. She tested me the way people test things they've been burned by before. She'd ask the same question twice to see if my answer changed. She'd leave money out on the counter just to see if it stayed put. One afternoon, she deliberately told me she'd misplaced her wedding ring, then watched quietly while I spent nearly an hour helping her look through drawers and under furniture before finding it exactly where she'd tucked it herself. She only nodded when I handed it back. She'd snap at me over small things, a glass left in the wrong cabinet, tea poured too hot, watching my face close as she did it, waiting, I think, for me to quit or to snap back. I did neither. I'd been through worse than a sharp-tongued old woman testing my patience. Chemo had taken more out of me than her words ever could. 3 weeks in, she asked me, out of nowhere, why I didn't have anybody calling to check on me. "Same reason you don't, I imagine," I said. She didn't answer that, but something in her face shifted, just barely, like a door easing open a crack. After that, the testing slowed. She started talking more about her husband, about the porch he used to sit on, about a life that had been full once and had quieted down to just her and 4 walls. I'd sit with her in the evenings after my work was done, not because the job required it, but because the silence in that house felt different than the silence in mine. Hers had somebody inside it who wanted company. Mine just had me. One evening, near the end of my 3rd month, she set her teacup down without looking at me and said, plain as anything, "You ought to just move in. Stop going back and forth. I'd pay you for full time, not just the hours." I almost laughed at how casually she said it, like she was offering me the last piece of pie instead of a chance to be needed again. "I'll think about it," I told her, though I already knew my answer. For the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, somebody was choosing to keep me around, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because she wanted me there. 14 months slid by, the way good time does, quiet, steady, barely noticed until you look up and realize how much of it has passed. I learned Miss Birdie's body the way I'd once learned my own during treatment, which pills came with food, which ones she'd try to skip if I wasn't watching, the exact way she liked her tea poured so it wouldn't shake too much in her hands some mornings. I drove her to doctor visits, sat beside her in waiting rooms, held her arm on the days her knees wanted to give out on her. She let me in slowly, the way a woman does who's been guarded most of her life. She told me about her husband, Otis, gone 11 years now, how he used to sing off-key in the shower, loud enough to wake the whole street. She told me she'd wanted children and it never happened, and how her niece, Patrice, had been the closest thing to a daughter she had once, before life turned that into something thinner and more transactional. "She calls right before her bills are due," Miss Birdie said one evening, stirring her tea slower than it needed. "Funny how that works out." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't have to. I understood exactly what it felt like to watch a relationship turn into a calculation instead of a comfort. Patrice noticed me, eventually. She came by one Sunday in early spring, perfume too strong for the small living room, eyes moving over me like she was pricing furniture. She waited until I stepped into the kitchen to lower her voice to Miss Birdie, but the house was small, and I heard every word anyway. "You don't think it's strange?" she said. "A stranger, in your house, this close to you, this fast?" 14 months isn't fast, Miss Birdie said, flat. "And she's not a stranger. She's the one who shows up. I show up. Twice a year, and only when you need something." Miss Birdie's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Dovie's here every single day. She doesn't ask me for a thing." Patrice left not long after that, her goodbye clipped and cold, eyes cutting toward me on her way out the door, like I'd done something to her simply by staying. I came back into the living room once she'd gone, and Miss Birdie was looking at me with something steadier in her face than I'd seen before. "Don't let her rattle you," she said. "She's been waiting on something from me her whole life. You never have. That's the difference, and she knows it, which is why she doesn't like you." I sat down across from her, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could easily count. Nobody had defended me like that in years. Nobody had looked at me and seen somebody worth keeping, simply for showing up and staying. I let myself feel it, carefully. The way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. We kept our routine through the rest of that spring, steady as ever. Miss Birdie sharp-tongued and clear-eyed and fully herself. Until one morning, just shy of 2 years since the day Alton packed his bags and walked out my door, I came into her room with her morning tea and found her struggling just to sit up. Breath shallow, color gone from her face in a way I'd never seen on her before. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, and I counted every one of them sitting on the floor beside Miss Birdie's bed, holding her hand, telling her to breathe slow, telling her I was right there. At the hospital, they used words like cardiac event and stabilizing, and I sat in a plastic chair in the hallway until a nurse finally let me back in. Miss Birdie had already told them I was her live-in caregiver, and the person she wanted kept informed, so nobody questioned why I stayed close. I wasn't sure anymore what word fit what Miss Birdie and I had become to each other. I stayed at that hospital the way I'd stayed in her house, every day, most nights, leaving only to shower and change before coming straight back. The nurses started saving me a chair. One of them asked, gently, if I was her daughter. I told her no. Just somebody who showed up. Miss Birdie had good days mixed with bad ones that first week. On one of the good ones, she had me close the door and sit near the bed, her voice thinner than it used to be, but still carrying that same sharp clarity. "I called my lawyer," she said, "week before I got sick. Had him come straight to the house. I told her she didn't need to be thinking about things like that. I think about exactly what I want to think about," she said, "and I'm telling you so you're not surprised later." She studied my face for a moment. We talked through everything. He made sure I understood every paper before I signed it. She held my gaze. "You didn't ask me for a thing this whole time. That's why I'm doing it." I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't want to make this moment about anything but her hand in mine. She held on for 9 more days. I was there at the end, the room quiet except for the machines, her breathing slowing the way a candle goes out when there's nothing left to burn. She didn't wake again after the 3rd night. I stayed anyway. the way I'd stayed through everything else, until a doctor finally came in and confirmed what the silence in that room had already told me. Patrice arrived 4 hours later, dressed like she'd come from somewhere important, asking the nurses sharp questions about paperwork before she'd even asked which room her aunt had died in. She found me in the hallway and looked at me the way she had that Sunday in the living room, like I was something she needed to figure out the price of. "I assume there's a will," she said, not even bothering with hello. "I assume so too," I told her. "I don't know what's in it." That was the truth. I hadn't asked, and Miss Birdie hadn't told me more than what she'd already said that one quiet afternoon. 3 days after the funeral, the attorney asked me to come to his office. After confirming my identity, he explained that Miss Birdie had named me as the primary beneficiary of her estate. The house, her savings, a small rental property she'd owned outright for years. The documents were clear, signed properly, and left no confusion about her intent. I sat on the edge of my rented bed afterward and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since my last day of treatment. Grief and disbelief tangled together so tight I couldn't separate one feeling from the other. I hadn't shown up for this. I'd shown up because nobody else would. The will was filed for probate 2 weeks later, entering the public record of Shelby County. Just over 2 years since the morning Alton packed his bags and walked out my door for good. I didn't know any of this when it happened. I only found out about it later, pieced together from things Kendra let slip and things Patrice said with too much satisfaction in her voice. But I've turned it over so many times since. I can tell it now like I was standing in the room. Patrice had mentioned at a family gathering that her aunt, Bertie Lofton, had passed away. She complained more than she grieved, saying probate would probably drag on for months because Bertie had owned more than one property. A few days later, Dwight was at his aunt's kitchen table helping her look up an old property dispute that had nothing to do with me. Something about a fence line and a cousin twice removed. Before they finished, Patrice mentioned again that Bertie's estate had probably already been opened in probate. Curious more than anything else, Dwight pulled up Shelby County's public probate records to see whether a filing had been made yet. It had. An estate, a house, savings, a rental property, all of it listed as part of Bertie Lofton's estate. And right there in the probate filing, identified as the primary beneficiary, my name. He called Alton before he'd even finished reading the docket. "You're not going to believe this," he said, soft at first, the surprise still settling. Then he read the estate inventory aloud, and his own voice picked up speed the way a man's does when he realizes he's found something worth more excitement than caution. Alton didn't answer right away. From what I understand, he sat with it a moment, still carrying whatever resentment he'd built up over those 2.5 years. Still telling himself, maybe, that I'd been the burden, that walking away had been the reasonable thing to do. Resentment is a hard thing to set down quickly, even when the ground underneath it shifts. "How much?" he finally asked. "Exactly." Dwight read the figures again, slower this time, like he wanted his father to feel the full weight of them. Whatever guilt either of them might have been carrying about those missed birthdays, that unanswered voicemail, 3 years of silence. It didn't survive that phone call. I imagine it went the way guilt usually does in people who've already decided what they want. Quietly, without ceremony, replaced by something colder and far more useful to them. "She's never going to just hand it over," Alton said. "Not after everything." "She doesn't have to know that's what we're after," Dwight said. There was a pause on the line, the kind I picture clearly even though I wasn't there to hear it. Alton turning the idea over, testing its weight the way you'd test a ladder before climbing it. "We need a reason to bring her back in," he finally said. "Something she can't say no to. Something that looks like family, not money." Another pause. And we need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we tip our hand. 2.5 years since he'd packed those 2 suitcases and walked out my door without a word of explanation. And that conversation, calculated, careful, dressed up to look like nothing more than ordinary family planning, was the first real interest either of them had shown in me since. Not my health, not my recovery, not the empty years I'd spent rebuilding a life out of nothing. Just the number Dwight had read from that probate filing, slowly enough for his father to understand exactly what they'd left behind. I learned the shape of this part the same way I learned the rest. After the fact, from things Kendra finally admitted once she couldn't carry the weight of it alone anymore. But she told it to me clear enough that I can lay it out exactly as it happened. Kendra's engagement had given Alton the cover he needed. A celebration, not a confrontation. Something that looked like family, exactly the way he'd wanted. He sat Dwight down at his sister's kitchen table and laid it out plain. "We invite her to the dinner," he said. "Frame it soft. Make things right. That's all she needs to hear. If she pays without blinking, without asking a single hard question, that tells us she still wants back in bad enough to hand over money for it. We push further from there. Maybe she helps with bills again. Maybe more down the line." "And if she doesn't pay?" Dwight asked. Alton didn't even pause. "Then we already know where we stand. And we move different. The dinner's the soft version," he added. "If she shuts that door, then we'll start looking at every other option." Kendra found out the full shape of it almost by accident, overhearing her father and brother through a half-closed door the week before the dinner. She told me later she felt sick hearing it laid out so plainly. Her own engagement turned into bait. Her own mother turned into a target with a number attached to her instead of a name. She thought about calling me. She told herself instead that maybe her father's intentions were partly real underneath all the calculation. That maybe some piece of him did want me back, even if the money had opened the door for it. She didn't stop it. She told herself silence wasn't the same as participation. They invited 25 people, cousins, neighbors, people from church who'd ask no questions about why an engagement celebration had grown so large or so expensive. Alton chose the restaurant himself, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list that didn't print prices, because prices were never meant to be the point of the night for anyone but me. By the time I arrived, appetizers, wine, and the first courses were already on the table, with the kitchen preparing the expensive entrees that had all been ordered in advance. The whole plan depended on me seeing the size of that bill before I had a single second to think my way around it. The dinner failed. Only afterward, once it was obvious I wasn't coming back quietly, did Alton start calling attorneys. Kendra told me he met with a lawyer who specialized in marital property the following week. The lawyer explained plainly that inheritance is generally treated as separate property in Tennessee, but because no divorce had ever been filed, there might be arguments worth exploring depending on how the property had been handled. It wasn't a strong case. The lawyer made that clear. But Alton hadn't liked hearing how uncertain it was. He'd only liked that there was an argument at all. A soft opening, dressed up as love, a lawsuit, considered only after that softer version failed to get what they wanted. By the time I walked into that restaurant believing I was finally being welcomed home, every detail of that night had already been decided without me. And not one piece of it had anything to do with making things right. By morning, the story had already made its way around the family the way stories like that always do, fast and twisted a little more with every retelling. Patrice called somebody who called Kendra's cousin who called somebody else, and by noon, half the people who'd sat at that table the night before had told their version to somebody who hadn't even been there. Alton walked into that dinner expecting to walk out looking generous, forgiving, the bigger man. Instead, he was the man whose own wife paid the bill and handed the leftovers to a homeless shelter in front of 25 witnesses. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew what I'd done and how light I felt afterward. Like I'd set something down I'd been carrying so long, my shoulders had forgotten what it felt like without it. Alton didn't feel light. From what Kendra told me later, he barely slept that night, replaying the moment his smile dropped in front of everyone he'd invited to witness his big, generous gesture. By morning, humiliation had curdled into something harder. He called the lawyer he'd already spoken to before the dinner, the one who'd given him just enough hope about marital property to make walking away from the soft approach feel less like defeat and more like moving on to the version that actually worked. She made her choice, Alton told Dwight, like I'd been the one who'd set the trap instead of walking blind into one. Now we use the version that doesn't depend on her cooperating. He didn't spend much time deciding. Within the week, he'd filed, not for reconciliation, not for clarity, but for divorce, built specifically around a claim that Miss Birdie's estate, received while we were still legally married, counted as something the marriage itself was owed a share of. No separation papers had ever been filed in 3 years. That gap, the one he'd left open out of carelessness or convenience, had just become his entire legal argument. Kendra heard him explain the filing to Dwight over the phone, casual, like he was discussing a business deal instead of his wife of 30 years. She told me later that something in her finally cracked hearing it laid out, that, plainly, not heat-of-the-moment anger, but cold, deliberate strategy, dressed up afterward as something he was owed. She didn't call him that week, didn't answer when he called her. She told herself she just needed space to think, the same words he'd used on me 3 years before, though she didn't see the echo in it until much later. I knew none of this. I spent that week the way I'd spent most weeks since Miss Birdie passed, quiet, steady, finally feeling something close to peace. I'd paid what I had to pay, walked away with my dignity, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't waiting on a phone call from anybody. I'd stopped checking my messages every hour. I'd started sleeping through the night again. I was standing in my kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, humming something low while I watered the plant on my windowsill, when a knock came at my door. Sharp, official, nothing like the soft knock of a neighbor or a friend. A man in a plain jacket stood on my porch holding a thin stack of papers, asking if I was Dovey Boatwright, telling me I'd been served. I read the papers standing right there in my doorway, the man in the plain jacket already gone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Divorce. Filed by Alton, and buried in the language, dressed up in terms I had to read twice to fully understand. A claim on a share of Miss Birdie's estate, the house, the savings, the rental property, on the grounds that it had come to me while we were still legally married. 3 years of silence, and the first real paperwork he'd ever produced wasn't an apology. It was an invoice. I didn't cry over it the way I might have once. I set the papers on my kitchen table, made myself a cup of tea, and sat with them until my hands stopped trembling from something closer to anger than grief. Then I picked up my phone and started calling attorneys. I found one by the end of that week, a woman named Attorney Ransom, sharp-voiced, no patience for wasted time, exactly what I needed. I told her everything, the separation that never became a divorce, the 3 years of silence, the dinner, the filing. She listened without interrupting, the way Miss Birdie used to before she'd finally weigh in with something cutting and true. Tennessee treats inheritance as separate property, she told me. As a general rule, it's yours, plain and simple, especially since it came through a will that names you directly, not through any joint effort during the marriage. She paused. But that doesn't mean his side won't try to argue otherwise. They'll likely claim commingling, that funds got mixed somewhere, or that the marriage somehow contributed to how you came to inherit it. We'll need to be precise. Document everything. I told her I would. 2 days after that call, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. Kendra. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, but something made me answer. She didn't waste time on small talk. Mama, I need to talk to you. Not about Dad. About what I did. Her voice cracked somewhere in the middle of that sentence. I'm sorry. For the dinner. For all of it. I should have called you the second I found out what they were planning, and I didn't. And I've hated myself every day since. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, torn clean down the middle. Part of me wanted to believe every word of it. Part of me had learned, the hard way, what it cost to believe too quickly, too easily, in people who'd already shown me who they were once before. I hear you, I told her. Not forgiveness yet. Just an open door, narrow as it was. We talked longer than I expected to, and by the end of it, something in me had softened toward her, even while staying locked tight against her father and her brother. I let her back in carefully, the way you'd test a floorboard before trusting your full weight on it. A week later, Attorney Ransom called again. Her voice clipped in a way that told me before she even said it that something had shifted. Alton's attorney just filed a request, she said. They want your financial records, everything, going back to before Miss Birdie passed. Attorney Ransom's office filled up with boxes that week. Care logs I'd kept out of habit more than foresight, pharmacy receipts, doctor's visit summaries, every small record of the 2 years I'd spent keeping Miss Birdie alive and steady. I hadn't saved any of it thinking I'd need to prove my own life to a courtroom someday. I'd saved it because that's simply how I kept things. This is good, Ransom said, flipping through pages with the kind of focus that made me trust her more by the day. This shows a clear, documented relationship. Caregiver and client. Nothing tied to your marriage at all. She pulled out a copy of the will next, tracing her finger along the language near the top. And this, Birdie names you specifically, by name, for your care and companionship. Not as anyone's wife, just you. I hadn't read that line in a while. Seeing it again steadied something in me. Alton's attorney filed their response within days, and Ransom called me as soon as she'd finished reading it. They're making 2 arguments, she said. First, that you were still legally married when you inherited the estate. Second, they're suggesting we'll have to prove you kept that inheritance completely separate from any marital assets. They're looking for any sign of commingling that might give them something to argue. I waited. Have you deposited inheritance money into any joint account? Put Alton's name on the house? Used the inheritance to buy marital property? No. Good. I could hear papers turning on her desk. Then their position is still thin. There's no shared household during that period, no joint finances, no evidence he contributed to your relationship with Miss Birdie or to the estate itself. I think they're hoping the cost and stress of litigation will push you toward a settlement. She wasn't wrong about the exhaustion. I felt it creeping in some mornings, that old tiredness from treatment years, the kind that made giving up feel almost reasonable. But I'd already given up enough for one lifetime. I wasn't doing it again over something that was rightfully mine. Kendra called partway through that week, her voice steadier than it had been on our first call back. If it comes to it, she said, I'll testify that you and Dad were completely separated, that I watched it happen, that nobody in that house contributed to anything you built with Miss Birdie. She paused. I should have said something a long time before this. I'm not going to stay quiet now. I sat with the phone against my ear longer than I needed to after that call ended, something in my chest loosening for the first time in longer than I could measure. One of my children, finally choosing me over comfortable silence, It didn't erase the 3 years, but it was real, and it was hers to give, and I let myself receive it without guarding against it the way I had everything else lately. Dwight, though, watched his father's case thin out from the sidelines with a different kind of math running in his head. If Alton's claim collapsed, there'd be nothing in this for him either. No quiet path back into money he'd been counting on the moment he'd read my name on that probate filing. He wasn't willing to walk away with nothing. A week later, Ransom called me again, this time with a different kind of edge in her voice. "There's been a new filing," she said. "Not from Alton, from Patrice." I learned later that Dwight had reached out to Patrice himself, the two of them finding common ground in exactly the place you'd expect. Money neither of them had earned, both of them suddenly convinced they deserved a piece of it. He told her his father's case was thinning, that maybe the better play wasn't fighting over what I should owe the marriage, but fighting the will itself. If the will didn't hold up, none of it would be mine to argue about in the first place. Patrice didn't need much convincing. She hired a probate attorney within the week, and that attorney did what experienced probate attorneys do before filing anything. He requested the estate file, reviewed the probate record, and looked for anything that could support a challenge. He found one. While reviewing the file, he noticed that one of the witness affidavits attached to Miss Birdie's will had been re-executed several days after the original signing, because the first affidavit contained a clerical error. The corrected affidavit had been properly filed, but the dates no longer matched perfectly across every document in the record. By itself, that wasn't enough to invalidate a will. But combined with Miss Birdie's age and the fact that I'd been her live-in caregiver, Patrice's attorney argued it justified a will contest, questioning whether the will had been properly executed and whether undue influence had played any role. Ransom called me with that news in a voice tighter than I'd heard from her before. "This one's different," she said. "Alton's claim was thin from the start. This one raises questions the court will actually have to examine. That doesn't mean they'll agree with them, but we have to answer them properly." I felt the floor shift a little under me, hearing that. For one quiet evening, I let myself imagine the worst of it. Losing the house, the savings, everything Miss Birdie had wanted me to have, over paperwork that suddenly looked more complicated than I'd ever realized. But I didn't stay in that fear long. I'd already lost a husband, a house, 2 children's voices on the phone, and I'd survived every bit of it. I wasn't about to let a clerical issue finish what 3 years of silence hadn't managed to. "Find out what actually happened," I told Ransom, "before either of us panics over paperwork." She did exactly that. She obtained the drafting attorney's file, spoke with both subscribing witnesses, and confirmed the same story from every direction. The original witness affidavit had been corrected only after the paperwork was reviewed for filing. Miss Birdie had signed the will only once, in the presence of both witnesses, and had been lucid, clear, and fully herself throughout the meeting. The drafting attorney had even kept contemporaneous notes describing her reasoning and her state of mind that day, including her sharp wit. The same sharp wit I'd come to know so well myself. Ransom read portions of those notes to me over the phone, and something in me settled all the way down, steady as stone. I wasn't the woman who used to sit by a silent phone hoping somebody would call. I'd become someone who could hear a real threat, feel the fear of it honestly, and still stay clear-headed enough to fight it instead of folding under it. 2 pressures, building from 2 different directions. Both meant to wear me down until settling looked easier than standing my ground. I had no intention of settling. The court clerk called Ransom's office the following week with scheduling news that landed heavier than either of us expected. Alton's divorce matter and Patrice's will contest had both been set for hearings during the same week. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Plain walls, hard benches, nothing like the dramatic rooms you see on television. Months had passed since I'd first been served, filled with filings, document exchanges, and attorney meetings that seemed to generate more paper than answers. By the time we reached the hearing, there wasn't much left to surprise either side. I sat beside Ransom with my hands folded in my lap, steadier than I thought I'd be, watching Alton walk in from the opposite side with his attorney, not once looking my way. The judge called our matter first. Alton's attorney stood and made his case, smooth and practiced. 30 years of marriage. No divorce ever filed. An inheritance received while the marriage still legally existed. He argued that questions remained about whether any portion of the inherited assets had lost their separate character through commingling or other use during the marriage. The judge looked down at her notes. "Counsel," she said, "what evidence do you have that Mr. Boatwright contributed to this inheritance or that these assets became marital property?" Alton's attorney glanced at his file before answering. "The parties remained legally married throughout, Your Honor. We believe additional consideration is appropriate given the length of the marriage and the timing of the inheritance." "The length of a marriage isn't the question," the judge replied evenly. "The question is whether you have evidence supporting your claim." There was a pause. Alton leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. His attorney nodded and tried once more. "Our position is that the court should consider the entire marital relationship before determining whether the inheritance remained separate property." The judge looked back at the file in front of her. "I've reviewed the discovery materials. The parties had maintained separate households for years. There are no shared financial accounts involving these inherited assets, no evidence of commingling, and no evidence that Mr. Boatwright contributed to Mrs. Lofton's care or to the inheritance itself." She closed the file. "On this record, I find no factual basis to classify the Lofton inheritance as marital property or to award Mr. Boatwright an equitable interest in it. The petition is denied." That was it. No raised voices, no dramatic speeches. Just one ruling delivered in the calm, matter-of-fact tone that decides people's lives every day. I didn't look at Alton. I didn't need to see his face to know what landed on it. I felt Ransom's hand brush mine once, quick and quiet, the kind of small gesture that says more than words would in a room like that. One threat gone. I let myself feel that, just for a breath, before the heavier knowledge settled back in beside it. Patrice's claim was still ahead, and unlike Alton's, it had something real underneath it, a thread an attorney had actually managed to pull. The judge was already reaching for the next file before I'd fully caught my breath. "Next matter," the bailiff called, voice flat and procedural. "Estate of Bertie Lofton, Patrice Lofton versus Dovie Boatwright." Patrice's attorney stood with more confidence than Alton's had, opening with the date discrepancy on the witness affidavit like he'd found a crack in a dam. He spoke about an elderly widow, increasingly dependent on one paid caregiver, who ultimately inherited nearly everything. He never accused me of manipulation outright. He didn't have to. He let the suggestion settle in the courtroom and speak for itself. Ransom rose when it was her turn, calm as still water. "Your Honor, the defense calls the attorney who drafted Mrs. Lofton's will, followed by one of the subscribing witnesses." The drafting attorney took the stand first, an older man with a steady voice who'd clearly done this many times before. He explained that the date discrepancy resulted from correcting a clerical error in one witness affidavit after the original paperwork had been reviewed for filing. Miss Bertie had signed the will only once, in the presence of both witnesses, and the correction changed no part of her intentions or the execution of the will. He also identified his contemporaneous notes from that meeting, made in the ordinary course of his practice. In them, he'd recorded Miss Bertie's reasons for leaving her estate to me. "Dovie never asked me for a thing in 2 years," he had written after their conversation. That's exactly why she's getting everything. The second witness, the young notary, confirmed the same account without hesitation. She remembered an ordinary signing, a lucid client, 2 witnesses present, and nothing that caused her any concern. Then Ransom introduced 2 handwritten letters Miss Birdie had left with her attorney months before she passed. Both had been kept in his file with the estate documents. In them, she explained, in her own words, why she had chosen me as her beneficiary and made it unmistakably clear that the decision had been hers alone. The judge spent several quiet minutes reviewing the letters before looking back up. "I've reviewed the testimony, the attorney's file, the witness testimony, and these exhibits," she said. Together, they show a consistent picture of Mrs. Lofton's intent. "I find no evidence of incapacity, undue influence, or improper execution of the will." She turned toward Patrice's attorney. "Do you have evidence beyond speculation to support your challenge?" He didn't. "The will contest is dismissed," the judge said. "The estate shall be administered according to the will." I walked out of that courthouse into ordinary daylight, traffic moving past like nothing in the world had just been decided, and found Kendra waiting on the steps, hands wrapped around her own elbows like she was holding herself together. The remaining issues in the divorce were resolved not long afterward. The court confirmed the Lofton inheritance remained mine alone, and the marriage ended with nothing from Miss Birdie's estate awarded to Alton. Dwight quietly lost whatever hope he'd built around that money, and Alton was left holding nothing but the wreckage of a plan he'd built on a number instead of a name. "I want a real chance," Kendra said. "Just us. No reaching back toward them through me." I studied her face a long moment before I answered. The same way I once studied Miss Birdie's. The same way I'd learned to study everyone now. "I'll always have room for you," I told her. "Just you." The door for everybody else closed the night they sat me at a table I wasn't invited to.